Ranger's sudden bark led Walter straight into a rising line of fire that could have erased the whole clearing. Smoke curled low across the forest floor. Leaves snapped under heat. Ranger barked once, sharp, urgent, and Walter ran downhill with a shovel in his hand. The wind shifted. The flames leaned toward the cabin. Dirt flew. Boots pounded. For a split second, the crackling sounded like something else entirely. What would you have done in that moment? The sound wasn't loud, just a pallet slipping off a forklift, wood cracking against concrete, a quick, sharp bang in the back corner of the warehouse. But to Walter Hayes, it wasn't a pallet. It was contact. His body moved before his mind did. He dropped low, spun toward the noise, hand reaching for a weapon that wasn't there anymore. His breath locked in his chest. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Someone shouted his name. "Walter!" It took 3 seconds for the warehouse to come back. 3 long seconds. The forklift operator stood frozen, eyes wide. A stack of shrink-wrapped boxes leaned crooked against the floor. No smoke. No gunfire. No dust in the air. Just a cracked pallet and the smell of cardboard. Walter straightened slowly. His hands were shaking. He tucked them into his jacket pockets so no one would see. "I'm good," he muttered. But the shift supervisor had already seen enough. By the time Walter was called into the office, the story had grown larger than the sound that started it. He hadn't hurt anyone. He hadn't drawn a weapon. He hadn't even yelled. But he'd grabbed the forklift operator by the collar and shoved him against a shelf before his brain caught up. "You can't do that," the supervisor said quietly, folding his hands on the desk. "I know you didn't mean it, but we can't have that kind of reaction here." Walter nodded. He didn't argue. Arguing would mean explaining. Explaining would mean talking about things he had no interest in dragging into a break room with vending machines and a microwave that smelled like burnt popcorn. "I understand," he said. The supervisor slid a paper across the desk. "Termination. Effective immediately." Walter signed without reading the rest. His name looked unfamiliar in blue ink. Walter Hayes, 52 years old. Former infantry. Current liability. He cleaned out his locker in silence. A thermos. A pair of worn gloves. A photo of his father standing beside a pickup truck in front of a tree line that looked endless. He stared at that photo longer than he meant to. Ranger waited outside the security gate, lying in the shade near the employee entrance. The German shepherd lifted his head the moment Walter stepped out. Ears forward, eyes alert. Walter crouched and scratched behind the dog's neck. "Guess we're done here, buddy." Ranger leaned into him, solid, steady, no judgment. The drive to town felt longer than usual. Walter passed the same diner, the same hardware store, the same church sign that changed every week. Nothing had changed. But he had. He didn't go home. There wasn't much of a home left anyway. Rent was overdue. The landlord had stopped asking nicely. Instead, he parked in the far corner of a supermarket lot, under a broken light that flickered but never fully turned on. He cracked the windows for air. The October night was cool. Ranger climbed into the passenger seat and turned in a tight circle before settling down. His body stayed angled toward the windshield. Watching. Walter leaned back in his seat. The truck smelled like old upholstery and motor oil. He closed his eyes. The bang echoed again in his head. Not the pallet this time. Something else. Something older. He opened his eyes quickly and focused on the dark outline of Ranger's ears. "I'm fine," he whispered. Ranger's tail thumped once against the seat. Not loud. Just enough to say he was still there. Across the lot, a shopping cart rolled loose in the wind and bumped against a curb. metal on concrete. Walter's shoulders tensed, his jaw locked. He forced himself to breathe in. 4 seconds. Hold. 4 seconds. Out. He had learned that somewhere. Not in basic training. Later. After. A car pulled into the lot. Headlights swept across the windshield. Ranger didn't bark. He just watched until the engine cut and the driver went inside. Walter reached into the glove box and took out the old photo again. His father had taken him hunting near the Kentucky-Virginia line when he was 12. National forest land. Trails that ran quiet for miles. No forklifts. No echoing walls. "Maybe we go there," he said softly. Ranger's ears twitched. Walter folded the photo and slid it back into his jacket pocket. He stared out at the empty rows of parking spaces. The broken light above him flickered once more, then steadied. He could stay here, pick up day labor, try another warehouse, pretend the sound meant nothing, or he could drive north before dawn and see if the woods still felt the same. Ranger shifted and rested his head on Walter's thigh. Walter looked down at him. "All right," he said. "We're not done yet." He reached for the keys but didn't turn them. Not yet. The sky beyond the supermarket roof was turning darker, deeper blue. Morning would come soon enough. For now, he sat in the quiet, listening to the wind move through an empty parking lot, trying to remember what silence used to sound like. Before the bang, before the warehouse, before he started jumping at things that weren't there. Ranger kept watch until the first pale line of dawn edged the horizon. And when the sun finally rose, Walter started the engine and pointed the truck toward the highway that led to the forest. The road north was quiet that early. Long stretches of 2-lane asphalt, fields still silver with frost, barns leaning into the morning light. Ranger stood with his front paws on the center console, watching the road like he was on patrol. Walter kept both hands on the wheel. The truck rattled at 55. He didn't turn on the radio. He didn't want voices. By mid-morning, the hills began to rise. The highway narrowed. Signs for trailheads and campgrounds started appearing every few miles. He followed one marked for a dispersed camping area along the Kentucky-Virginia line. It wasn't remote. Not exactly. But it was far enough. He parked near a gravel pull-off beside a faded wooden sign. The forest stood dense behind it. Tall oaks, hickory, a line of pine further back where the slope dropped away. Ranger jumped down first. He stretched, shook once, then lifted his nose into the air. The dog's body shifted, alert, but not tense, curious. Walter pulled a small duffel from the truck bed, a tent, a sleeping bag, a camp stove, nothing fancy. Just enough. He walked 20 yards off the gravel and found a flat patch of ground beneath 2 wide trees. He set up the tent without thinking about it. Muscle memory. Keep your back to something solid. Clear the area. Check overhead branches. Ranger circled the perimeter twice, then settled near the entrance, watching the trees. By afternoon, the sun filtered through the leaves in broken pieces. The forest smelled clean. Damp earth, bark, no forklifts, no humming lights. Walter sat on a fallen log and let the quiet settle. For a while it almost worked. Then the wind picked up. It moved through the trees in a low rush that started somewhere high and rolled downward. Leaves rattled. A branch snapped in the distance. Walter's shoulders tightened before he could stop them. His eyes tracked movement that wasn't there. The forest shifted from peaceful to watchful. Ranger noticed. The dog stood, stepped closer, and pressed his flank lightly against Walter's leg. Not urgent, just steady. "I hear it," Walter said under his breath. "I know." He stood and walked toward the tree line, toward the deeper part of the woods. He didn't know why. Maybe to prove something to himself. Ranger moved ahead of him now, not wandering, Not distracted, focused. About 30 yards in, the marked trail veered left, clearly worn from use, but Ranger didn't follow it. He paused, looked at Walter, then angled right toward thinner undergrowth and a narrow gap between saplings. Walter stopped. "That's not the trail." Ranger looked back again, ears forward, waiting. Walter exhaled. "You're not the boss." Ranger stepped forward anyway. Walter hesitated, then followed. The ground sloped gently downward. Leaves muffled their steps. No signage, no paint marks on trees, just a faint depression in the earth like something had passed there before. They walked for several minutes without speaking. The forest grew quieter the deeper they went. No highway hum, no distant voices. At one point, Walter froze. A sudden crack of wood somewhere to his left. Sharp. Close. He dropped instinctively, knees bent, scanning. Ranger did not bark. The dog's ears flicked once, then he relaxed. A deer stepped into view 20 yards away, white tail flashing before disappearing into brush. Walter stayed crouched longer than necessary. His breathing came fast, then slower. "Just a deer," he muttered. Ranger turned his head toward him. Patient. Walter straightened and wiped a hand across his face. They kept moving. The slope leveled out into a narrow ridge. From there, the trees thinned just enough for light to reach the forest floor. Ferns grew in patches. The air felt cooler. Ranger stopped again. This time, he didn't look back immediately. He stood still, nose pointed forward, body angled downhill toward something Walter couldn't see yet. "What is it?" Walter asked quietly. No answer, of course. Just that stillness. Then Ranger let out one short bark. Not loud, not aggressive. Just enough to say something was there. Walter stepped past him. At first, he saw nothing but more trees, more shadow. Then his eyes adjusted. Down below, past a curve in the land, there was a break in the pattern, a shape that didn't belong to trunks and branches. Straight lines. A roofline, maybe. Walter blinked and stepped forward again. The wind shifted, and for the first time since leaving the parking lot, he felt something different move through him. Not fear, curiosity. Ranger took 2 steps down the slope without waiting. Walter followed. The slope wasn't steep, but the ground was uneven. Leaves shifted under his boots. Ranger moved ahead, careful but certain, weaving between saplings like he'd been here before. The shape below grew clearer. A roof, dark shingles, weathered but intact. Walter slowed. This wasn't a hunting blind. It wasn't a shed. It was a cabin. Small. 2 windows facing the ridge, a narrow porch sagging slightly on one corner. It sat in a shallow clearing as if the forest had stepped back just enough to let it breathe. Walter stopped at the edge of the trees. No smoke from the chimney. No truck parked nearby. No fresh tire tracks. Just quiet. Ranger stepped into the clearing first. His posture shifted from curiosity to procedure. Nose low, moving in arcs. He circled once around the cabin, then twice. Paused at the porch steps, sniffed the doorframe. No barking. Walter came forward slowly. The cabin looked old but not abandoned. The boards were gray from years of weather, but not rotting. The roof had been patched in places. Someone had cared about it. At least once. He stood at the base of the porch and listened. Nothing. No generator hum. No movement inside. Just wind brushing the leaves overhead. "All right," he said quietly. "Easy." He stepped onto the porch. The wood creaked but held. Ranger stood close to the door, body angled, waiting. Walter knocked. The sound echoed hollow inside. He waited, knocked again. Louder. Still nothing. He tried the handle. It turned. He didn't push it open right away. He stood there with his hand on the latch, jaw tight. This wasn't his place. He knew that. But the door wasn't locked, and there were no signs telling him to stay out. Ranger looked up at him. Walter exhaled and pushed. The door opened inward with a slow scrape. The air inside was cool and dry. It smelled like old wood, sawdust, a faint trace of oil. Light filtered in through two small windows. Dust floated in it. The room was simple. A table near the center. Two chairs. A narrow couch against one wall. A wood stove in the corner. No clutter. No trash. Ranger moved first. He stepped inside, paws silent on the floorboards. He swept the room in a slow circle, nose testing the air. Then he moved toward a doorway in the back. Walter followed, heartbeat steady but alert. He cleared the main room, then the bedroom. A small space. A single bed. Neatly made. A quilt folded at the foot. No clothes scattered. No food left out. The second doorway led to what looked like a work area. A sturdy bench. Tools hanging on a pegboard. Chisels. A hand plane. A wooden mallet. All covered carefully with a canvas tarp. Walter reached out and lifted one corner of the tarp. The tools were clean, oiled, organized, not abandoned in a rush. He set the tarp back down gently. "This isn't a squat," he murmured. Ranger stood by the bedroom doorway, watching him. Walter walked back into the main room and scanned again. On the table near the window sat a small stack of papers weighted down by a smooth river stone. Not legal forms, not official documents. Just a notebook. Spiral bound. Worn at the edges. He picked it up. The cover was plain. No title. No name. He flipped it open. Neat handwriting filled the first page. Dates in the corner. Notes about lumber. Measurements. Weather conditions. Further in, the writing shifted. Short entries. Observations. A line about a creek rising after heavy rain. A note about replating shingles before winter. Walter turned another page. There, near the top, was a name written clearly. Harold Whitcomb. Walter stared at it for a long moment. Ranger stepped closer and sat beside him. "All right, Harold," Walter said softly. "You live here?" He listened again. Still nothing. He walked to the window and looked out. From this angle, the cabin was almost invisible from the ridge, hidden just enough, a place someone would choose on purpose. Walter closed the notebook and set it back where he found it. He stepped outside onto the porch again and looked at the tree line. The wind had died down. The clearing felt still. He could leave, walk back up the ridge, pretend he never saw it. Or he could stay long enough to understand why a place like this existed out here, off the marked trail. Ranger nudged his hand. Walter glanced down at him. "You picked this," he said. "Not me." Ranger's tail moved once. Walter turned back toward the open door. "All right," he muttered. "Let's take a closer look." He stepped inside again, this time not as a trespasser, but as a man trying to understand the story of someone who had built something quiet and kept it that way. Behind him, the forest shifted slightly in the breeze, and for the first time since leaving the highway, Walter didn't feel like he was running. He felt like he had found something. He just didn't know what yet. Walter stood in the center of the cabin and listened again, as if the walls might answer him. Ranger stayed close, watching the door, then the windows, then Walter's face. "Let's see who you were, Harold," Walter said quietly. He went back to the table and picked up the spiral notebook again. This time he sat down, The first entries were practical. Lumber counts, measurements for rafters, notes about sealing gaps before winter. The handwriting was steady, careful, the kind of penmanship a man learns long before keyboards replace paper. Walter flipped a few pages. The tone shifted. March 12th. Saw the creek swell after the rain. Might need to raise the stepping stones before next season. April 3rd. Fixed the south window latch. No one to complain if it sticks but me. Walter paused at that line. No one to complain but me. He turned another page. Doctor says I shouldn't be climbing ladders anymore. Says the heart doesn't like it. I told him the roof won't fix itself. Walter leaned back in the chair. Heart trouble. Ranger moved closer and rested his chin on Walter's knee. Walter scratched behind the dog's ear without looking away from the page. June 17th. Thought about selling the place. Didn't. Not yet. The next entry was shorter. July 2nd. Lillian called. Didn't answer. Don't know what I'd say. Walter slowed down. He turned the page carefully, as if it might tear. September 8th. I don't want her remembering me in a hospital bed. If she comes out here, I want her to see the place standing. Walter swallowed. The cabin was not the project of a drifter. It was a choice. A man who built something instead of sitting under fluorescent lights waiting for bad news. He flipped forward to the last written page. The date was 3 years back. October 21st. Cold came early this year. Stove holds steady. Heart doesn't. If this is my last winter out here, it was worth it. No dramatic goodbye. No grand statement. Just that. Walter closed the notebook slowly. The cabin felt different now. Not empty. Not abandoned. Just paused. He stood and walked into the small bedroom again. The bed was made tight, corners tucked clean. A folded flannel shirt lay across a wooden chair. Not dusty, just old. On the nightstand sat a small framed photograph. A younger woman with dark hair, smiling beside an older man who looked like Harold might have looked 10 years ago. Walter picked it up. Lillian, he murmured. Ranger shifted in the doorway, restless. Walter set the frame back where it was. You think she knows? He asked the dog. Ranger's ears flicked, but he didn't move. Walter walked back into the main room and stood near the wood stove. He imagined the old man sitting in that chair by the window, watching the trees instead of hospital walls, waiting out the cold with a stubborn kind of dignity. He understood that part. The isolation, the pride, the decision to carry your own weight until you can't. But there was something else in the journal, something Walter hadn't expected. Loneliness. Not loud, not dramatic, just there between the lines. He sat again and ran a hand over the worn wood of the table. Outside, a gust of wind brushed the clearing. Leaves scraped lightly across the porch. Walter's shoulders tightened. For a split second, the sound bent in his mind, turned sharp, metallic. He blinked hard. Ranger stood instantly. Walter held up a hand. It's fine. The dog didn't sit right away. He watched Walter's face until the tension drained from it. Walter breathed in slowly. Not here, he said to himself. Not now. He looked back down at the journal. A final loose page was tucked inside the back cover, not written in the same steady tone. The pen had pressed harder into the paper. If something happens and this place outlasts me, I hope whoever finds it understands. It was never meant to hide. Just to live. Walter read that line twice. Whoever finds it. He looked around the cabin. He had found it. Ranger stepped closer and leaned against his leg again. Walter rested his hand on the dog's head. Don't worry, he said quietly. I'm not here to take anything. He stood and walked to the door. The clearing outside looked the same as before. Sun filtering down. Quiet, holding steady. But now the place had weight. It wasn't just shelter. It was a story unfinished. Walter stepped back inside and closed the door gently behind him, not locking it, just letting it rest in the frame. He didn't know yet what he was going to do, but he knew one thing. He couldn't just walk away. Walter stood in the doorway for a long moment, looking out at the clearing. The air had shifted. Late afternoon now. Shadows stretching longer across the porch boards. Ranger lifted his head suddenly. Not a deer this time. An engine. Faint at first. Then closer. Walter stepped off the porch and moved toward the edge of the clearing. Through the trees up on the ridge, he caught a flash of movement. Sunlight reflecting off a windshield. A vehicle. Ranger moved to his side, posture straight, quiet, but alert. The engine cut. A car door slammed somewhere above. Boots on gravel. Walter's jaw tightened. He didn't run. Didn't hide. He walked back toward the cabin and waited at the base of the porch steps. A man in a tan uniform shirt and dark pants came down the slope. Mid-50s, solid build, hat low over his brow. Sheriff's star pinned to his chest. Sheriff Coleman. He stopped 10 yards away and took in the scene. The cabin. Walter. The dog. "Afternoon," the sheriff said evenly. "Afternoon," Walter replied. Ranger stood between them, not growling, not moving forward, just present. "Got a call this morning," Coleman said. "Neighbor up the ridge thought he saw someone down here. Cabin's been quiet a while." Walter nodded once. "Found it yesterday." "You own it?" "No, sir." "Permission to be here?" Walter didn't hesitate. "No, sir." The sheriff's eyes flicked to Ranger, then back to Walter. "You planning to stay?" "Wasn't planning on anything long-term." Coleman stepped a little closer. He glanced toward the open door of the cabin. "You break in?" "Door wasn't locked." "Doesn't make it yours." "I know." The wind moved through the clearing again. Ranger's ears shifted, but he stayed still. The sheriff studied Walter's face. Not suspicious, not hostile, just measuring. "You military?" Coleman asked after a moment. Walter gave a small nod. "Yes, sir." "Recently out?" "Not recently." Coleman's gaze lingered, then softened just slightly. "You alone out here?" Walter looked down at Ranger. "No, sir." A corner of the sheriff's mouth moved. Not quite a smile. "Cabin belongs to a man named Harold Whitcomb," he said. "Or it did. Property taxes still paid. No activity in a few years." Walter felt that land heavier now. "He passed?" "Far as I know." Walter glanced toward the table inside where the notebook lay. Coleman followed his gaze. "You find something in there?" "Just a journal." The sheriff shifted his weight. "Listen, I don't care if you're camping up by the public pull-off. That's legal. But this?" He gestured toward the cabin. "This is private property, even if nobody's using it." "I understand. I'm not hauling you in. Not today." Coleman's voice was steady. "But I can't have you squatting here either. If the owner or next of kin shows up, that becomes a problem." Walter nodded again. "How long you need?" Coleman asked. Walter hesitated. "Couple days." "For what?" "To figure out who to call." Coleman held his gaze, long enough to decide something. "You've got 48 hours, he said. "After that, I expect you back up at the public site, or gone." "Yes, sir." The sheriff glanced down at Ranger. "Dog trained?" "Yes, sir." "Good. Keep him leashed near the road. Folks get nervous." Ranger's tail moved once. Coleman stepped back toward the slope. "One more thing," he said without turning. If you find any valuables in there, you leave them where they are. You want to do right by the dead. That's how you start." Walter met his eyes. "That's the plan." The sheriff gave a short nod and climbed back up the ridge. The engine started again. Gravel shifted, then silence returned. Walter stood still until the sound faded completely. Ranger relaxed first. Walter let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. 48 hours. He turned toward the cabin. "I guess that's our window," he said quietly. Ranger looked up at him. Walter walked inside and picked up the journal again. He flipped to the page with Lillian's name. "If something happens and this place outlasts me." He closed the notebook. "All right, Harold," he murmured. "Let's see if your daughter's still in Lexington." Ranger followed him back out onto the porch. The clearing felt smaller now, less like discovery, more like responsibility. 48 hours. Walter looked toward the ridge where the sheriff had disappeared. Then he looked down at Ranger. "We're not hiding," he said. "Not this time." Ranger held his gaze, and for the first time since losing the warehouse job, Walter felt the ground steady beneath his boots. Not safe, not certain, but steady. Walter didn't waste the light. He walked back up the ridge before sunset, Ranger close behind, and drove into the nearest town with a gas station, a diner, and a cell signal strong enough to hold a call. He parked beside the diner and sat for a minute with the phone in his hand. The number had been written in the back of the journal. Just a name and a city. Lillian Moore, Lexington. No promise it still worked. Ranger rested his head on the center console and watched him. Walter pressed call. It rang longer than he expected. A woman's voice answered. Calm. Careful. "Hello?" Walter swallowed. "Ma'am, my name is Walter Hayes. I'm calling about a man named Harold Whitcomb." Silence. Then softer. "Who is this again?" "I found a cabin, near the state line. There was a journal inside. Your name was in it." Another pause. Not confused, not angry, just bracing. "My father passed 3 years ago," she said. "He didn't own any cabin." Walter looked out the windshield at the darkening sky. "I believe he did," he said gently. "It's small, built well, tools still there, journal too." On the other end, he could hear her breathing change. "I haven't spoken to my father in a long time," she said. "Where exactly are you?" Walter gave the general area. Not coordinates, just the region. "That land was in his name," she said slowly. "He bought something out there years ago. Wouldn't tell me what." Walter nodded even though she couldn't see him. "I'm not here to claim anything," he said. "Sheriff gave me 48 hours to clear out. I just thought you should know it's standing, and it's been cared for." Silence again. Then, "Is it damaged?" "No, ma'am." "Did he leave anything?" Walter thought about the notebook, the photograph, the line about not wanting her to remember him in a hospital bed. "There's a journal," he said, "and some personal things." Her voice shifted. Not fragile, just heavier. "I live about 2 hours from there," she said. "I can drive down tomorrow. I'll be there." He ended the call and let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Ranger's tail thumped once. "Tomorrow," Walter said. "We'll see." They drove back toward the forest under a sky turning deep blue. That night, Walter didn't sleep in the tent. He stayed in the truck near the public pull-off, as the sheriff had allowed. Ranger curled in the passenger seat, but kept one ear lifted. Walter stared at the ceiling of the cab, listening to the small sounds of the woods. No forklifts, no metal echoes. Just wind. Morning came colder. Walter and Ranger walked back down the ridge early, arriving at the clearing before the sun reached it. Walter swept the porch with an old broom he'd found leaning inside. He straightened the quilt on the bed. Not to impress anyone, just out of respect. Ranger moved through the cabin slowly, as if checking it again. Late morning, an engine sounded on the ridge, different from the sheriff's truck, smaller, lighter. Walter stepped outside. A silver SUV came into view at the top of the slope. It stopped. A woman in her early 50s stepped out, dark hair streaked with gray, practical shoes, hands tucked tight at her sides. She saw the clearing, then the cabin. She didn't speak right away. Walter stayed where he was, not approaching, giving space. "You must be Lillian," he said. She nodded once. Ranger stood beside Walter but did not bark. "You're the one who called." "Yes, ma'am." She walked slowly down the slope, each step careful, like she was stepping into memory she hadn't agreed to revisit. When she reached the porch, she stopped. "My father built this?" she asked. "I believe so." She touched the porch railing, ran her fingers along the wood grain. "He never told me where he went," she said. "Just that he needed quiet." Walter didn't respond. She stepped inside. Her eyes moved across the room. The table, the stove, the tools beneath canvas. Then she saw the journal. She walked to it and opened it without sitting down. Walter watched from the doorway. Ranger lay down quietly near the threshold. Lillian flipped through pages, stopped, read, turned another. At one point, her hand covered her mouth. "He wrote about me?" she asked without looking up. "Yes, ma'am." She turned to the bedroom. When she came back out, her eyes were red but steady. "I thought he left because he was tired of us," she said. "Turns out, he just didn't want to be seen sick." Walter nodded. "There's something else," he said. Ranger stood and walked toward the workroom. He stopped near a loose floorboard Walter hadn't noticed before. The dog pawed lightly at the wood. Lillian looked down. Walter stepped forward and crouched. The board shifted under his hand. "Mind if I—" She nodded. Walter lifted the board carefully. Beneath it was a small envelope, yellowed, sealed. Lillian's name written across the front. Her breath caught. Walter handed it to her without opening it. She held it like something fragile. "I don't know what's in there," he said quietly. She didn't answer. She just stared at her name written in her father's hand. The clearing felt very still. And for the first time since finding the cabin, Walter wasn't the one carrying the weight. Someone else was. Lillian didn't open the envelope right away. She carried it to the small table and sat down slowly, like she needed the chair to hold more than just her weight. Walter stepped back toward the porch. Ranger stayed near the doorway, watching both of them. The paper tore softly in her hands. Walter didn't read it. He didn't need to. The words were not his. He stepped outside and let the clearing breathe around him. The forest was still, sun high now, a woodpecker tapping somewhere deeper in the trees. Ranger followed him out and sat on the porch beside him. After a while, Lillian came out too. Her eyes were clear, not dry, just settled. "He wanted me to come," she said. "He just didn't know how to ask." Walter nodded. "He wrote that he didn't want you to see him sick," he said. She gave a small, sad smile. "That sounds like him." They stood in silence for a moment. "I can't keep this place," she said finally. "I live in the city. I have a job, a family. I don't even know how to fix a hinge." Walter looked toward the loose board in the workroom. "It's solid," he said. "Roof needs a little work on the east side. Porch corners sagging. Nothing major." "You noticed all that already?" He shrugged. Comes with looking. She studied him for a long second. You weren't planning to take it, were you? No, ma'am. She believed him. He could see that. I don't want to sell it, she said. Not yet. I need time, but I also don't want it to fall apart. Walter waited. He didn't step toward the offer before it was spoken. She glanced at Ranger. He yours? Yes, ma'am. He's calm. He's trained. She nodded once. Would you consider staying a while? She asked. Just to keep an eye on it. I can work out something fair, nothing complicated. Just help me hold it steady. Walter felt something shift inside him. Not pride, not relief, responsibility. I've got 48 hours, he said. Sheriff's clock. I'll call him, she said. Tell him you're here with my permission. Walter nodded slowly. I'll fix what needs fixing, he said. No more. That's all I'm asking. They shook hands. Not formal, not businesslike. Just two people standing in the middle of something neither of them had planned. By late afternoon, Lillian drove back up the ridge. She looked once more at the cabin before getting into her SUV. Thank you, she said. Walter didn't answer with words. He just tipped his head. The clearing grew quiet again. Ranger stretched out on the porch, chin on paws. Walter walked around the cabin with a tape measure he found in the workroom. He checked the porch posts. One was soft at the base. He pressed his thumb into it. All right, he muttered. We'll start there. He worked until dusk. Not fast, not rushed, just steady. He removed the rotten section of post and replaced it with scrap lumber from the shed, cutting carefully, fitting it snug. The tools felt familiar in his hands. The rhythm of measure, cut, fit. Ranger patrolled the tree line every few minutes, then returned to sit where he could see Walter clearly. That night, Walter didn't sleep in the truck. He laid his sleeping bag on the cabin floor near the stove. He didn't light it, just listened. The wind moved through the trees again. The first rush of sound tightened his chest. Ranger stood immediately and walked over, pressing against him. Walter closed his eyes. Just wind, he whispered. The dog stayed there until his breathing evened out. Morning came without the echo of forklifts in his head. Walter stepped outside with a cup of coffee heated on the small camp stove. He sat on the porch and watched light creep across the clearing. Ranger lay at his feet. The cabin didn't feel like a hiding place anymore. It felt like work, not the kind that gets clocked in and out, the kind that asks something of you. Walter stood and looked at the east side of the roof. After breakfast, he said, we'll check those shingles. Ranger's tail thumped once against the wood. For the first time since losing the warehouse job, Walter had something to fix that wasn't inside his own head. And for now, that was enough. The days found a rhythm. Walter rose with the light, checked the roof, reinforced the porch, oiled the hinges on the shed door. Ranger moved through the clearing like a quiet sentry, circling the tree line before settling near wherever Walter was working. It wasn't glamorous work. It wasn't fast. But it was steady. On the fourth evening after Lillian left, the air felt different. Dry. Walter noticed it first when he struck a match to light the small camp stove and the flame flared brighter than usual. Wind's up, he muttered. Ranger's ears twitched. They were finishing up near the east side of the cabin when Ranger froze mid-step. His head snapped toward the lower tree line. Not curious this time. Alert. Easy, Walter said, straightening. Ranger let out a low, sharp bark, then another. Not frantic, urgent. Walter moved toward him. At first he smelled it before he saw it. Smoke. Thin, bitter. He stepped past the brush and saw a faint gray ribbon rising through the trees about 100 yards downhill. Damn, he breathed. Not a wildfire. Not yet. Just a small flame licking at dry leaves near a fallen log, probably from a careless camper. Maybe a cigarette. Maybe a fire pit, not fully drowned. The wind shifted again. The flame caught. It spread faster than it should have. Walter didn't think. He grabbed the shovel leaning against the porch and ran. Ranger sprinted ahead, stopping short of the smoke line, barking once to mark it. Walter reached the edge of the burn and started beating at the flames with the flat of the shovel. Dirt. Smother. Stomp. "Stay back!" he shouted to Ranger. The fire wasn't large, but it was hungry. Dry leaves crackled. Heat rose quickly. Walter's breathing shortened, not panic. Focus. He scraped a quick firebreak with the shovel, clearing a ring of dirt around the advancing edge. He kicked loose soil over the base of the flames. The smoke thickened. For a split second, the snapping of wood shifted in his mind. Turned sharp. Too sharp. His body tensed the way it had in the warehouse. The way it had in places he tried not to name. Ranger barked again. Closer now. Louder. Walter blinked hard. "Not now," he growled. He forced his eyes back to the ground, to the dirt, to the real fire in front of him. Smother, stomp, smother again. After what felt longer than it was, the flames began to shrink. Smoke thinned. The heat eased. Walter stood there a moment longer, shovel planted in the dirt, making sure nothing glowed beneath the leaves. Ranger moved closer and nudged his leg. "It's out," Walter said quietly. They walked the perimeter twice. No sparks, no flare-ups, only scorched leaves and the smell of something that could have been worse. Walter wiped sweat from his brow with the back of his sleeve. "Good catch," he said to Ranger. The dog's tail moved once, steady. A truck engine sounded on the ridge. Walter looked up. Sheriff Coleman's vehicle came into view at the top of the slope. He must have seen the smoke from the road. The sheriff stepped out, eyes scanning the clearing, then the blackened patch below. "You call it in?" Coleman asked as he came down. "No time," Walter replied. "It was small." Coleman studied the ground. The clean firebreak, the shoveled dirt. "You beat it down yourself?" Walter nodded. Ranger stood beside him, posture calm now, but watchful. Coleman looked at the dog. "He spot it?" "Yes, sir." The sheriff walked the edge of the burn area. He crouched and pressed a hand to the dirt. "You did it right," he said after a moment. "If that wind had caught it 5 minutes longer, it would have climbed that slope." Walter didn't answer. Coleman stood and faced him. "You've worked fire before?" "No, sir." "Sure moved like you had." Walter shrugged. Coleman watched him for a long second. "You planning to stick around?" the sheriff asked. Walter glanced toward the cabin. "I've got permission from the owner," he said. "Helping keep it up." Coleman nodded slowly. "County could use someone who knows how to pay attention," he said. "Part-time trail maintenance opening next month. Nothing fancy. Just eyes on things. Making sure fires don't get ahead of themselves." Walter didn't respond right away. The offer hung there. Ranger looked from the sheriff to Walter. "I'll think about it," Walter said finally. Coleman gave a short nod. "Good work today," he said. Then he turned and headed back up the slope. When the truck was gone, the clearing felt quieter than before. Walter looked at the blackened earth. 5 minutes. That was all it would have taken. He rested the shovel against the porch and sat down heavily on the top step. Ranger came over and leaned against his shoulder. Walter closed his eyes. The crackling had faded. The smoke smell was thinning. The sound in his head was quiet too. For now. He opened his eyes and looked out at the trees. "You found it," he said softly to Ranger. "Before I did." Ranger's tail brushed the porch boards once. Walter leaned back against the cabin wall. The place wasn't just shelter anymore. It was something worth protecting. And maybe, for the first time in a long while, so was he. The blackened patch of earth stayed visible for days, a reminder of how close things had come to spreading. Walter walked the perimeter each morning, checking for heat beneath the soil. Ranger followed, nose low, making sure nothing lingered. 3 days after the fire, Lillian called. "I heard from the sheriff," she said. "He told me what happened." "It was small," Walter replied. "It wasn't small if it could have taken the place." There was a pause. "I've been thinking," she said. "I don't want to just thank you. I want to make this official." Walter leaned against the porch post, phone to his ear. Ranger stretched at his feet. "Official how?" "I spoke with a lawyer in town," she said. "Simple caretaker agreement, month to month. You stay. You maintain the property. I pay you something fair. We keep it clean and above board." Walter stared out at the ridge. "You sure?" he asked. "Yes." He nodded slowly, though she couldn't see it. "All right," he said, "if that's what you want." "It is." She drove out the following Saturday with papers in a slim folder. Nothing complicated. A few pages, clear terms, no promises beyond maintenance and respect. Walter read every line. He signed carefully. His hand didn't shake. Ranger sat beside him the whole time, tail resting against the porch boards. When Lillian handed him a spare key, she didn't make a speech. She just said, "Take care of it." "I will," he answered. After she left, Walter stood alone in the clearing with the key in his palm. It wasn't ownership. It wasn't rescue. It was trust. He moved his gear fully into the cabin that afternoon, rolled his sleeping bag onto the bed instead of the floor, set his duffel in the corner, hung his jacket on the back of the chair. Ranger claimed a spot near the east window, where the morning light slipped through first. 2 weeks later, Sheriff Coleman returned. He stepped out of his truck without tension this time. "You still thinking about that maintenance job?" he asked. Walter nodded. "Yes, sir." "It's part-time. Trail checks, clearing brush, reporting hazards. Pays modest, but it's steady." Walter glanced at Ranger, then back at the sheriff. "I'll take it." Coleman gave a short nod. "Start Monday." The first morning on the job, Walter walked a marked trail with a county-issued vest and a clipboard that felt heavier than it should have. Ranger moved just ahead of him, leash loose, ears attentive. The trail was simple: fallen branches, a loose board on a small footbridge, a fire pit someone hadn't fully drowned. Walter knelt and pressed his hand to the dirt. Still warm. He covered it completely, smoothed it down. Not dramatic, just necessary. By midday, the sun warmed the trees. The forest didn't feel like something he had to brace against anymore. It felt like something he understood. That night, back at the cabin, Walter opened Harold's journal again. He found the final entry and read it slowly. "If something outlasts me, I hope it's the work." Walter closed the notebook and set it beside the lamp. Ranger patted over and rested his head against Walter's knee. "You're part of it too," Walter said quietly. He stepped outside onto the porch. The clearing looked the same, but it didn't feel temporary anymore. There was a rhythm now. Morning checks, repairs, patrols, coffee on the porch. Ranger at his side. He hadn't stopped being who he was. He had just stopped running from it. The wind moved through the trees again. This time, Walter didn't flinch. He listened and let it pass. The wind moved through the trees and kept going. Walter stood on the porch until the light shifted from gold to gray. Ranger stretched at his feet, then rose and padded toward the east side of the cabin where the morning sun always came first. It had been 3 months. 3 months since the warehouse, since the parking lot, since that first narrow trail Ranger refused to ignore. Walter stepped inside and looked around. The cabin no longer felt paused. There were new boards on the porch, a repaired hinge on the shed, a stack of split wood under the eaves, cut clean and even, his boots by the door, his jacket on the chair. Ranger's water bowl sat near the east window. Walter walked over and pushed the window open a few inches. Cool air slipped in. He remembered how he had cleared rooms in the dark once, how he used to map exits before he could breathe, how every sound used to arrive sharp and wrong. Now the forest had its own rhythm. Birds at dawn, wind mid-afternoon, the slow crack of cooling wood at night. Different sounds. He sat in the chair by the window. Ranger climbed up beside him, resting his head across Walter's knee. "You did this," Walter said quietly. Ranger's tail moved once. Walter looked down at the dog's graying muzzle. The scar near his shoulder from years ago. The steady way he watched doors and windows without needing to be told. "You wouldn't let it go," Walter said. He reached for Harold's journal from the table and flipped to the back again. "If something outlasts me, I hope it's the work." Walter closed it and set it aside. The cabin wasn't his in name. It never would be. But it was his in responsibility. Lillian visited once a month now. Sometimes she stayed an hour, sometimes the whole afternoon. She brought groceries, asked questions about repairs, told stories about her father that hadn't made it into the journal. The first time she heard Walter laugh, she looked surprised. The county trail job had settled into routine. Nothing dramatic, just fallen branches, loose planks, the occasional reminder to campers about fully putting out their fires. Sheriff Coleman stopped by sometimes without a reason, just to check. "You sleeping all right?" he asked once. "Better," Walter said. That was true. He still woke at times. A sharp noise could still reach too far into memory, but the gap between reaction and reality had grown wider. He had space now. Ranger stood one morning and nudged him before dawn. Not urgent, just insistent. Walter followed him outside. The sky was pale, almost white. The first light touched the ridge, then slid slowly down the trunks toward the clearing. It reached the east window and spilled across the porch boards. Walter watched it happen. No forklifts, no metal, no shouting. Just light. Ranger stepped off the porch and walked toward the trail that led back up to the ridge. He paused there and looked over his shoulder. Walter smiled faintly. "You want to check it?" he asked. Ranger waited. Walter grabbed his jacket and followed. They climbed the slope together. Not in a hurry, not looking for anything in particular. Halfway up, Walter stopped and looked back. From that angle, the cabin was barely visible, tucked into the trees, quiet, standing. He thought about the first time he saw it, how he had stood at the edge of the clearing, unsure if he had the right to step forward. He thought about the fire, about the sheriff, about the phone call to Lexington, about signing his name on a simple caretaker agreement and not feeling like his hand would shake apart. Ranger nudged his thigh lightly. Walter exhaled. "It wasn't the house," he said softly. Ranger tilted his head. It was the work. He looked back toward the trail ahead. There would be more repairs, more wind, more nights that tested him. The past didn't disappear just because the present steadied, but he wasn't alone inside it anymore. Ranger stepped forward again. Walter followed. The forest opened in front of them, not as something to hide in, but as something to walk through. And this time, when Ranger pulled slightly toward the deeper path, Walter didn't hesitate. He went with him. That's the part that matters. Walter didn't find treasure. He didn't win a lawsuit. He didn't suddenly become someone new. He chose to follow the path his dog refused to ignore. And step by step, that choice changed everything. Sometimes healing doesn't look dramatic. It looks like showing up, fixing a loose board, putting out a small fire before it spreads, calling someone when you could have walked away. Ranger didn't rescue Walter with strength. He rescued him with loyalty, with patience, with the simple refusal to leave his side. And maybe that's the lesson. When someone is carrying more than they can say, don't push them aside. Stand beside them. Stay steady. Give them something worth protecting. Walter didn't stop being a veteran. He didn't erase his past. He found a place where his discipline, his vigilance, and even his scars could serve something good. And he didn't do it alone. What do you think made the real difference in this story? The cabin or the dog? Type 1 for the cabin. Type 2 for Ranger. If this story meant something to you, stay with us. There are more journeys like this ahead. Quiet ones, strong ones. The kind that remind us it's never too late to walk the right trail. We'll see you in the next one.